Well, welcome to the public webinar series at Tokyo College, Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Tokyo. My name is Naoko Shimazu, and I'm professor and deputy director of this college, a global historian, and the moderator for today's webinar. So allow me to introduce today's panelists. Our speaker today is Professor Ole WÆVER, who is Professor of International Relations at the Department of Political Science, University of Copenhagen. He's the founder of CAST, which stands for the Center for Advanced Security Theory, and the director of CRIC, which stands for the Center for Resolution of International Conflicts, since 2013. And of course, he's our visiting Tokyo College professor. Now, I have had the privilege of knowing Professor WÆVER, Ole, for a few decades now. So we won't say when we first met, but it's been such a great pleasure to have him visit us so that we can sort of, get back to getting to know each other again. It's been really wonderful. So welcome, Ole. Now, Professor WÆVER coined the term securitization and is a key figure in the Copenhagen School of Security Studies. During his visit to Tokyo College, he's working on this concept of economic security and engaging interdisciplinarily with linguists, philosophers, among others. Now, Professor WÆVER is a recipient of many prestigious prizes, and most recently the Hartmann Prize in 2024, Erik Rasmussen Prize in 2022, and James N. Rosenau Prize from the International Studies Association in 2020. And just one more honorary doctorate from the University of Turku in 2015, to name but a very few. Professor WÆVER is a prolific author, so I am not going to list your huge, long and influential publications. But in the interest of time, I just want to flag up the most recent one, which is a jointly authored article with Charlotte Epstein, The Turn to Turns in International Relations, from the which is going to be in the European Journal, which is already out in the European Journal of International Relations, 2025. Now, to comment, we have IGATA Akira. Very welcome, big welcome to you, a project lecturer specializing in economic security intelligence at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at the University of Tokyo. And this center is called, in Japanese, Sentan Kagaku Gijutsu Kenkyu Center. And he works on economic security as well, a buzzword in Japan currently, and attempting to understand the changing international environment in which Japan finds itself, especially in relation to China, Russia, and the United States. So for those of you in the audience, at TC, or Tokyo College, we are currently trying out different formats for our webinar series. And so today's session will be 60 minutes in total, about 20 minutes presentation by the speaker. And then we have Professor IGATA speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, and he will kickstart the discussion. And there will be a bit of toing and froing amongst the panelists here. And then we will also have opportunity to open up to the floor for some questions. Before you start, I'm sure many of you know this already, but there is simultaneous interpretation available. So please click the button, translation button at the bottom of the screen in order to switch to Japanese. And for the Q&A session, please post your questions in English or Japanese in the chat box on the screen. So without further ado, Professor Ole WÆVER will speak on three-dimensional geopolitics, great power rivalry, planetary dangers, and post-colonial assertiveness.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and generally for hosting me here and for the chance to talk about this. So my argument here basically is that it has become hard to grasp the big picture in world politics. And doing so used to be one of the key tasks of my discipline, international relations. We are supposed to be able to tell people whether we are in a Cold War, a clash of civilizations, a global community, but what is the picture today? And just one clarification before I get going for real. I'm not going to start from Trump, except that, of course, I'm doing it now. But the one frustrating thing about the period we're in at the moment is that any discussion about world politics easily turns into speculation about what is going on inside President Trump's head. And this kind of Trumpology is both annoying because we end up not thinking about what we want, what is going on in Europe, in Japan, and so on, and make sense out of the world on its own terms. So I'll try, in a sense, to give my standard talk, the 3D talk here, and then add Trump at the end of it, in a sense, also a way of questioning my own analysis and say how much does the Trump factor then upset or maybe strengthen the story that I'm otherwise giving. And the talk is called, as you've seen in advance and can see now on the screen, Three-Dimensional Geopolitics. And the three dimensions are great power rivalry, planetary politics, and the post-colonial turn towards the global south. Those three grew out of a previous version where there were only two, and this followed from a general puzzlement about the fact that if you talk generally about the big picture, about the world, most people actually shift between two pictures that are difficult to mediate. In some context, if you say world politics, big picture, everyone will say, yeah, that big confrontation, US, China, Russia, Ukraine, and so on, that's the big picture. And then on other, I'm supposed to be there. Good. So this is what the kind of big picture that will come in many contexts. And then the next minute, when we talk about how is it all going, everyone is thinking the big issues are climate change, artificial intelligence. These are really the decisive questions that our era is all about and which will decide how it all goes. And both are obviously true, but the problem is we are not very good at having both pictures in our head at the same time. So that was my basic idea. How do we understand the world in a way that respects that both of these big pictures are relevant? And then just to complicate things even more, I thought I would bring in a third dimension, or actually also thereby, I would argue, making it more accurate and also more dynamic. So my argument is really that these are three different dynamics that are at play: superpower rivalry, planetary threat, and the global south. Not in the sense that they're competing, not that we should try to find out which one is going to win. They're all three becoming more important at the same time at present. And they're intersecting with each other. And the combination of the three sometimes have paradoxical effects. Even good ones sometimes. Of course, sometimes, most of the time, world politics, our subject matter here, is usually an area where bad stuff happens. And when things play illogically into each other, it often gets even worse. But sometimes it also gets better. So I'm also trying to point out that the three happening at the same time might actually explain sometimes why surprising possibilities or openings are coming for us. But basically, the whole idea is world politics is difficult these days for scholars, for policymakers, for us all as citizens. And I will argue that is really because we have these three parallel realities that cannot easily be brought on a shared formula, but yet are also closely connected. So what are the three? Well, the first one is the classical one, great power rivalry. The world has a power structure. I'm not saying that the power structure in the world is driving everything. It's not like everything that happens in the world is because of a rivalry between the great powers. But when something happened, it matters a lot what power structure we have. So if there's a civil war in Syria or a border clash in somewhere in Southeast Asia, is not always, often not, because of great power mechanics. But whether the world can act on it deal with it is very much determined by what kind of power structure we have, what kind of relationship we have among the great powers. In my discipline, international politics, the term we turn to when we want to capture the great power structure is the term polarity. And that is mostly due to one guy, Kenneth Waltz, who wrote the most influential theory book in the discipline, Theory of International Politics, it's called in all modesty, in 1979. Recently, with some colleagues, I did an edited volume around this question as well, in the honor of a colleague, who Birte Hansen, who died far too young a few years ago. Kenneth Waltz is arguing that polarity is the key concept. And in some sense, it's both obvious and strange. It's obvious that we are interested in the great powers and their distribution. But polarity is strangely focusing on the number of great powers. So obviously you can say, who are the great powers? How many, where are they? Who is how powerful? That's obviously relevant. But why would it be super interesting how many there are? That is the key argument of this very influential theory. So it's not saying that the number of power determines whether we have power balancing, rivalry, wars, and so on. We always do. But how we have it is played out very differently depending on whether the world is multipolar, meaning there are a number of great powers, 5 or something, or whether it's bipolar and you only have 2 powers. Historically, in a multipolar system, you have the kind of maneuvering, we ally with them, but maybe they're allying with each other. The kind of movement around in groupings, which is maybe more fun, but also unstable and can easily lead to misunderstandings and so on. Bipolarity with 2 dominant powers is more rigid, but maybe also more stable, was his argument. And he was arguing then that things like tripolarity with 3 powers or unipolarity with 1 dominant power is fundamentally unstable transitory forms. The last element about unipolarity is a bit fun because when the Cold War ended, the US found itself in a situation of at least near unipolarity. And at the time, the whole foreign policy elite was brought up on this theory. So they should say unipolarity is impossible. But then they realized that the US is more or less the unipolar pole in the world. And that was kind of cool. It would be nice if it could stay. So they had to kind of believe that they could go against what they have always been taught and keep this US domination, which of course they couldn't. So if we run through the history very quickly, we can say we had bipolarity during the Cold War. We had almost unipolarity, at least for a while, until maybe 2008. Then a lot of people are arguing, it's almost become a cliche nowadays, that the world is multipolar. I would argue that is missing a lot, that this is not as obviously the right designation as it would seem. There are still elements of unipolarity. The US is still have unique forms of power. I would also say the period we had from 2008 until now, more or less, was really a world without superpowers rather than multipolarity. And that was because it was not really that the US was challenged by a rising power. It was rather that the US abdicated from having as strong a position as it had had. And this is maybe the most nerdy element of what I'm going to say today. Multipolarity really means that you have a number of great powers who are sitting in the same system, closely interacting with each other. The concept is basically Eurocentric. It grew out of the European experience of all the great powers being near to each other in a regional setting. For the world to be multipolar today, all the powers had to be relatively closely connected in a system where they have to take each other into account. That has not been the case until now. Most powers can kind of opt in and participate on some issues and opt out and just have a low profile on other issues. So maybe like during the first Trump period, Japan and the EU would try to keep the global economy in place, and China and the EU would try to keep the climate regime running. And so you could opt in and out of this situation. We didn't for a while really have anyone wanting to be superpower. The US really didn't want to, China didn't want for a while. So in a sense, we had the opposite problem of what we usually have. In a sense, too little power rather than too much power, was not powers clashing, rather that no one took charge of climate, global trade, intervention in Syria, and so on. No one really wanted to be a superpower for a while. That is gradually changing, and you might argue increasingly that the world is becoming bipolar. It is the case if you look at GDP. There are clearly two countries, US and China, running far ahead of everyone. You can say that's maybe unfair, that here we haven't aggregated the EU. If we do that, you get that there are three economic centers. But then if you look at the military ranking, the three are the US, Russia, and China. And in that sense, you come back to the fact that the only ones that really have both economic power and military power and a kind of general position in the system are the US and China. So we have also seen increasingly big confrontations. It's probably fair to say that the coming 10 years, we will also have more of that. The US and China and their confrontation will matter more and more. More, especially on certain issues and in certain places. More in Asia than the rest of the world. More on technology issues than on other issues. So that's why more and more people talk about kind of new Cold War. I would still argue it's not as the same as the old Cold War. First of all, it is not as comprehensive in terms of what it covers. Those of us who are old enough to remember the real Cold War remembers when cultural dynamics, tourist travel patterns, everything was shaped like that. It was basically two separate economic systems. So even if we're talking delinking and so on today, still we are not seeing, to a similar degree, two separate worlds. And the second big difference is that the rest of the world, and I'll of course get back to that a lot more, are not buying into it to the same extent. Most of the world do not want to be part of this situation. And an important point here is that there was a push for a while, especially during the Biden-Blinken period, for seeing all of the world in one big formula as a confrontation between democracies and autocracies. And I would try to warn against that as a problematic ideological idea and a bad roadmap in the sense that it is not helpful to see the world like that. If there is a series of coups in West Africa, the best way for us to have a foreign policy is not to find out whether one coup maker is slightly more democratic than another coup maker. It's probably better to understand the kind of anti-French post-colonial legacy there. So the idea that you can sum up everything in terms of autocracies and democracy is not very helpful. This is the first point where Trump comes in a sense, as a help, because clearly he is also disaggregating this. It was already wrong before him to see a bloc of China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and so on, more like a kind of occasional tactical synergy between them. But Trump really does not, to the same extent, run this policy up here. First of all, it's because he's more interested in geoeconomics rather than in geopolitics. And in terms of geoeconomics, the real enemy is China and Germany / the EU, definitely not Russia. So he has a different pattern of conflicts. And therefore, we will still have lots of geopolitics, a lot of rivalry, but it will be more disaggregated than it looked until Trump. We can discuss whether this is actually the accurate interpretation of Trump. There's an element that more people are talking more about these days after the national security strategy came out a week ago, that maybe the US is really pushing for a kind of division of the world according to spheres of interest, the US, Russia, China, talking about a core 5 institutional setup with US, China, Russia, India, Japan. I would still actually here be enough of a realist and argue, I think that the underlying polarity and rivalry US-China is going to assert itself. And even if you read the national security strategy closely, it is actually quite clear that that is still the underlying theme. Okay, until the second form of geopolitics, the planetary threat. That, I would argue, is also geopolitics. It just geo in the sense of Earth. It's about the whole. It's a planetary collective existential threat, often driven by technologies like in climate change, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, and so on. My field, international relations, often gets that wrong by thinking, oh, these issues are not security issues. They are cooperation issues. How well are we cooperating on these new issues? But they are actually security issues as well. These are existential threats and dangers, climate change, potential artificial intelligence, and so on. But the problem is that they are security threats in a dual sense, that something like artificial intelligence is both a potential threat to all of us collectively, but also at the same time, potentially a big multiplicator of power among the powers, and therefore it's very difficult to cooperate on these issues because you fear that if you don't maximize your own version of it, you will weaken yourself. You could argue the same around climate change, that really the reason why we didn't get more collaboration on climate change, especially in the early period, back to the Kyoto 1997 agreement. Basically, the reason why it was not ratified in the US was a concern that if we did climate policy in that way, it would mean that China would rush ahead of China, and that would therefore be unacceptable. So in that sense, what I'm arguing here is that these two forms of geopolitics are playing into each other both ways, both in the sense that it's hard to cooperate on the global issues because we also have the rivalry, but the other way around also, if you want to be a global power, you also have to lead on these issues. And this brings me to my first example that sums up the triangular dynamic of that. And that's the question of loss and damage in the global climate agreement. Loss and damage is basically the third leg of climate policies, to simplify a bit, and the one that the global south cares most about. So climate policies basically have first the question of mitigation. Can we prevent it from happening? And there is also a global south element because there had to be transfer of technologies and economics and so on. The second leg is adaptation. We adapt to the things that are happening. Also here, there's also a global south dimension of money to help. But the third is loss and damage. The things that can't be prevented, can't be helped. We just have to accept the loss. In extreme cases, small island states that will disappear, but also people who will lose their livelihood, their possibilities of things and so on. And that has to be compensated only. You can't do anything more than that. And there at COP27 in 2022, there was a surprising breakthrough, basically due to the EU, of accepting this idea, which the global north had previously been against, because it can end up being very expensive for us because we are the guilty ones. And then on COP28, we surprisingly, on day one of the conference, had an agreement on how to specify it further, which is very strange because at COP meetings, you usually have your agreement 2 weeks after the conference was supposed to end, and here we had it on day one. And I would argue that is illustrating this triangle, that it is in a situation where the competing big powers have a sense that it's necessary to do something on the things that matter to the global south, and therefore we have an action on the planetary threat. So in that sense, I think it's a beautiful example of how all three come together. But let me say something more general about the third component, the global south element. Here for me, the central element is about a new self-assertiveness. And the big, easy example to look at that is the Ukraine war, where the West found itself surprisingly not followed by the rest of the world. There was an expectation in the West that it was such an obvious case, such a glaring black and white question of who was the guilty, Russia. Therefore, everyone should support. And then we look back and, oops, they are not following. We are not being, we don't have the world behind us. That started a certain element of a sales work, and the press was covering it more or less as a sports competition. Now you have a vote in the EU, in the UN that goes to the West, and now we have a UN vote that goes to the OA. And that kind of missed the point, because the point was not so much whether the Global South would side more or less with one side or the other. The main point was that the Global South would prefer not to have world politics hijacked by a regional war in Europe. People in Africa would say, we have had regional wars here, and then they're seen as regional. Now, because it's in Europe, it has to take the whole global agenda. And this dawned on me when I was sitting in Kampala, having given a similar talk in 2022, and I was on Danish radio to talk about the G20 meeting in Bali, quite symbolically, Bali in Indonesia, which was the leading non-aligned power during the Cold War. And the resolution that came out of that meeting was really about saying, we don't accept that all the other things we were supposed to do together are now being pushed back because of a conflict in Ukraine. So the reaction from the Global South was not so much where you stand, but it was rather to minimize the issues, kind of cooptation of everything else. And that was understood in the West. There was clearly an effort to listen, not only to propagate our own views, but also to try to understand, okay, what is it the Global South wants in order to be interested in working together. Then came the Gaza war, and a lot of that was lost in the sense that the Global South basically has the reaction of saying, now we see again the hypocrisy and the insincerity of the West and so on. It's important here to emphasize that this turn to the Global South is not about a third power bloc. An influential IR author, John Eigenberry, who often senses what is happening, but also often gets it a little wrong, is basically arguing that now we have the three blocks of the world of East, West, and South. That's not the point. The South is not a bloc, nor is there an institution we should focus on. It's not about BRICS or G20 and so on. There's a lot of rivalry going on in the global South, not least between India and China. And who are the members of the Global South? Is China in or out? Are the Gulf states in and out and so on? That's the wrong question. The point is that the Global South, the big majority of people and majority of countries, is where the momentum is coming from, which is a historical normalization that all of the world starts to count. Global majority matters. Population growth, economy, they matters in their own right, as markets, as a future, but also as the arbiter between the great powers. So in my view, this will be the iconic picture in the history books summing up this period we're in. This is South Africa being the one taking Israel to the International Court of Justice on the genocide case over Gaza. And the fact that it's done by South Africa, which to so many epitomizes the post-colonial, anti-colonial, is really summing up how these things come together at the moment. So let me sum up then finally, whether the Trump effect then has upset this or not. At first you can say, yes, it weakens the coupling of this. The US, as we saw at the recent COP meeting in Rio, is not playing this game very well. They don't care much for the Global South. They don't care for the global challenging. They don't connect things very well. But that might be good for my model in the long run, because one of the best criticisms you could make of my theory here was really that the US was simply too powerful, that they would eventually get everyone in place and fit in. And now they're not doing that. And therefore, the whole model is, I think, working its way through more systematically, more slowly. And therefore, the rift will grow between the US and the Global South. And the triangle will have its full time to take hold and slowly work its way. So I think in that sense, my analysis is also helped by Trump and his inability to discipline the world back and use optimally the power that the US still has. And therefore, we are back in this dynamic, which is my suggestion for how to make sense out of the big picture. Now I'm very keen to hear the reaction from my colleagues here and to discuss with people who in the audience as well. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Professor WÆVER. So we're going to move to Dr. IGATA for comments.
Sure. Thank you so much for that masterful description of what's going on around the world, because I think I'm working on international politics. I follow the news everywhere around the world, and I still have a hard time really grasping what's going on, right? Once again, I'm really honored to be here. I still remember vividly 1 year ago when I went to Copenhagen University to give a talk on the securitization of economy, as if I knew everything. And then there you are at the stands, right there, the person who actually coined the word securitization. And now you're here. So I'm glad that we are continuing to cooperate on these issues. So since this is a three-dimensional geopolitics, let me try and comment. Some of them are observations, some are questions on each of the dimensions that you pointed out. First, on planetary threats, I have two quick points. One is on the issue of climate change, because you are correct that climate change is a planetary threat. But at the same time, if you look at the development around the world in the last couple of years, I feel like this move towards trying to deal with climate change had slowed down a little bit. For instance, of course, the US is an easy option. They're saying that we have been engaging in excessive environmentalism. If you look at the new national security strategy of the United States, it actually says that climate change is an ideology. And I'm sure many would disagree with that. But then you look at many of the major European countries as well, from France to Germany to, let's say, Central Eastern Europe countries and so on, the former champions of decarbonization. And I'm starting to see a little bit of a shift, right? Because, Russia is invading Ukraine, the economy is in shambles. We have many more problems that we have to deal with that are pressing. And so they're not denying that climate change is real, but they are saying that, maybe we've done enough. Maybe we're green enough for now. And I'm starting to see these phrases like green realism in different countries. And just this morning, right, the European Union has decided to curtail its ban of the internal combustion engine sales for cars. So I guess my first question is, how do you see this development? Is it just a blip and we'll see it coming back soon? Or could this be a new trend towards prioritizing security, economy over the environment? And then my second question regarding the planetary threats are the issues of critical and emerging technologies, because you mentioned artificial intelligence, you talked about quantum computing, I can add a few more, biotechnology, biomanufacturing, hypersonics, you name it. They could be a planetary threat, but at the same time, these technology, if implemented well, they could be solutions too. Right? So if you can be a little bit optimistic here, what do you think are the possibilities of these critical and emerging technologies not being planetary threats, but planetary solutions? Now let me go to the second dimension regarding the Global South. I completely agree. It's important. There's about 120, 130 countries are in Global South, and it's not a bloc. And I try to listen to experts from those countries to really understand how they're looking at, once again, this complicated world that we live in. And I tended to notice that there are stark differences among the Global South countries in that there are certain countries powerful enough to be able to take best of both worlds, right? Take India, for instance. They are part of BRICS, which is on the, let's say, the global East side, but they're also part of many of the global West minilateral institutions. And they seem to be doing all right with both, precisely because they have the population, that they have the economic power, they have the diplomatic wherewithal to be independent and to have agency to some extent. But then most of the smaller Global South countries, they don't have that option, right? To me, they seem to lack agency, because if America tells them to buy certain things, they have to the extent that they have money. If the Chinese tell them to build certain things, they have to. And so even though, most of these hundreds of countries in the Global South is critical for, I guess, deciding the fate of this strategic competition between US and China, how should we be engaging the Global South? What would be the most effective way to engage with them so that we can bring them together on, let's say, our side for the sake of the argument? And then that brings us to the third most difficult part of the dimension, right? Polarity, international politics 101. You mentioned that 2008 to 2025 was more or less, there were no polarity, no superpowers, but now you're starting to see that it is a US-China, a bipolar world. And let me try to challenge you a little bit on that, because once again, the new US national security strategy that came out last week was too shocking for me. And I'm still trying to understand what the implications are, but I think it's very significant because the way the national security strategy portrayed Europe in ways that might be even worse than how it portrayed China or Russia was one shocking to me. It was also clear that the United States is no longer ready to be to take the burdens to fulfill the role that it has had in the international politics, and saying, look, Japan, you have to share some of the burdens. Europe, you have to do your thing, and so on. And during the presentation, you talked about how certain countries have the ability to opt in or opt out on certain things, which means that in terms of the actual powers of the countries, yes, US and China, economically and militarily, these are probably the two poles. But given the fact that the new Trump administration might be opting out from certain international developments, could it mean that we're now seeing a weird hybrid version of bipolarity or even multipolarity, where US would leave us, the rest of the world, to deal with certain problems? And maybe it's not US and China polarity that we have to look at. Maybe Europe would try to balance against China and Russia, or maybe Japan would try to partner up with like-minded countries like, again, Europe and let's say South Korea, Australia, and other like-minded countries. So those were, I guess, observations, summer questions. It'll be great to hear your thoughts on them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very, very, very good point. And I definitely agree with the basic thrust of all the points, but let me try to kill on one after each other, just give a few words. I agree on climate change, that the situation is different now, also different from Trump 1. There are two important differences. The one is that the US is not just absent, they are directly sabotaging international agreements. As we saw with the one recently on international shipping, and so on, they're really trying to blackmail other countries to not take part in these agreements. This is just one step off from last time. It's also true that Europe is modifying its policy. I still think a lot of people get that wrong in the sense of thinking that Europe is moving away from the green agenda. There's more of a kind of attempt to merge the green agenda and a kind of industrial policy, a kind of economic realism in that it has to be fitted to what is economically viable. Some of the things that interest you about economic security and that is playing a bigger role. But the basic coalition in Europe is still holding up that it is a very green strategy. And so I think one should not underestimate how much Europe is still sticking to a quite a strong commitment on climate change. And then I think the climate itself will also keep us honest on that, in the sense that there's no way of avoiding these issues, really. On critical and emerging technologies, you're right that there are also possibilities here. Last month, I was back in Denmark for a big conference we organized on Niels Bohr and his open letter to the UN in 1950 on nuclear weapons, after his own role in participating in quantum mechanics, of course, and so on, to bring about the nuclear weapons. And he was very much emphasizing that there is this complementarity between the opportunities and the dangers on the nuclear weapons, nuclear technologies, and now again, of course, as you rightly say, on artificial intelligence, quantum, and so on. But the problem is, how do we handle the risk side of it? It seems to me that artificial intelligence is maybe the most striking, in the sense that we can maybe have regional based regulations like in the EU, and China has a strategy and the US has a strategy for the more kind of applied side of it, how it influences social media and social dynamics and so on. But the underlying technologies and those that could potentially create general artificial intelligence with wide-ranging effects and so on, we're not able to regulate, we're not able to deal with. So there are some existential threats there that we are blocked from dealing with because we have the geopolitical rivalry at the same time. And that is, for me, a worry. On the Global South and how to engage, I think an important part is here to accept that there's no way of getting the Global South to choose. That we have to understand that there are genuine agendas coming out of Africa and Latin America and so on, and they have to be allowed to take their share of world politics. And they will also should be allowed to shop around and both have relations to China and the US and so on. Any attempt to force them into one fold or another is counterproductive. And then finally on polarity, and as we talk about the national security strategy from last week, yeah, and I totally agree that the Europe part in that report is absolutely shocking. Basically saying that Europe has to be saved from the European Union by the far right, that could be supported by the US and so on. It's quite extreme. And it's almost treated as domestic politics, which I sense is also a bit revealing that part is really more about thinking of Europe and US so close that we just do the same domestic agenda in Europe as we do at home. When I actually read it, compared to also what I had heard in the press, I was struck by how much the rivalry with China is actually underlying all of it, even if often not named. So when it's writing about Latin America, it's all about really to make sure that Latin America chooses the US over China. Africa the same, Asia the same. Everything is about how others position against an unnamed China a lot of the time. So I think China is much more present in that strategy than one actually notices. So I actually think it confirms the impression, and therefore to your final question about how should we then think of it, I think we have to accept that is a structuring element in the global politics. It will be this China-US rivalry, and we will have to think about our different arrangements. I think in Europe we are doing that by coming around to having to basically end up militarily and so on, being able to stand more on our own feet. I guess we'll get to talk about Japan as well. That I don't envy. I think the Japanese situation is quite a bit more difficult than the one in Europe.
Maybe just quickly on the Global South piece, I remembered how a couple of years ago I was at the international conference in the Philippines, and they were all talking about this slogan, DMUC. MUC, don't make us choose. And that was basically all of the sessions, right? Even when we're talking about military issues or economy or environment, basically they said DMUC, DMUC, DMUC.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems that DMUC concept is something that at least harks back to the Bandung period in the 1950s, because that was the whole point, wasn't it, about the Bandung, that there was this, a new kind of, well, I wouldn't, as you say, maybe at that time they might have thought about a bloc, but a new force in international politics. And perhaps maybe this is really the period that such kind of ideas are coming more into kind of reality. But I was thinking about what Dr. IGATA said about this kind of whole notion of Global South, perhaps at the end of the day, not having as much agency, in this very complicated geopolitics that's been happening at the level of the, stronger powers. Because when I was in Singapore, I was involved in this project on the China and Belt Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative. And what was really striking was that there's actually quite a lot of work done on from the grassroots level. So in other words, there are lots of research projects going on in African countries, Southeast Asian countries, and so on. And the results there actually show that in fact, it's not completely right that they don't have agency, because at the local level there is always some kind of advantage, right, to be there on the spot. You know the system, that is your culture, your everything. And so I think in a way they probably have a bit more agency than we are led to believe. And also it is the hegemonic discourse, right, which wants us to think that they don't have agency. So I think that's something that was quite striking in at least with my experience on researching in these kinds of things. So I actually have a question for both of you, because I simply cannot let this opportunity go with two people, experts, working on this idea of economic security. And it seems to me to be a very, very pertinent concept. And I know that Professor WÆVER has been, basically you're here to look into this idea, and Dr. IGATA is like a big noise on this thing in Japan too. So could I please ask you to first of all tell us about what this idea is and how different is it from different kinds of other security kind of conceptions that you have? And you're Mr. Securitization here too. So just tell us about it and how this affects your conception of the three-dimensional geopolitics, this idea of economic security, and also this geoeconomics that you introduced in your talk.
Maybe I think Akira is the real expert on this. You should go first on economic security, but maybe I'll just say a little about the global south and Bandung, and then pass the word to you. I think that there's a paradox that has made a lot of people in Europe kind of been a bit blindsided by the role of the global south at the moment. That the paradox is that if you look at the non-aligned movement back in the Cold War, it was more of a bloc because it was up against blocs, and that was the only way to do it, but it was also much weaker. Now, the global south has developed economically and politically, and in so many ways, that is actually much stronger. We were used to thinking about the global south as a kind of, we're people we should pity and give money and whatever. And now when they're doing better, there should be less of an issue. No, they're doing better, therefore they are stronger. So now the global south is actually playing from much more of a position of strength, not as a bloc, but as just in multiple points. It's just where things happen and what is ultimately putting the pressure on the system. So that is why I think we're getting it wrong much of the time. But I think you should speak first on economic security, then I'll add something.
Sure. Quickly regarding the global south countries actually having some agency, maybe they're being shrewd too. They're complaining that, oh, we don't have agency, but then they actually do. So, you have to be smart to live in this complex world. Economic security. Usually I have like 60 minutes, 25 PowerPoint slides. Unfortunately, I have 30 seconds. So basically, economics and security, they used to be distant. Now there are so many areas where these two overlaps. And that has really changed the relationship between the public sector and the private sector. This is probably because the rise of critical and emerging technologies, where any type of these new technology could both be dual use, meaning it's of interest from the public sector and also the private sector. It is also these difficulties in geopolitics, where you have countries like China and Russia and US increasingly using economic coercion, which is basically meaning that you use imports or export or students or whatnot. You use economy and leverage it for diplomatic and security reasons. And because of this, the government has to care more about economic issues, and the private sector also have to care about security issues. And this has resulted in a new world where different countries now requires new type of law, policy, institutional structure to deal with these new challenges, such as how do we try and make sure that our supply chains aren't only economically efficient, but more diverse so that it is resilient? Or how do we protect our critical infrastructure from new threats like cyber attacks and so on? Or how should the government try and subsidize and regulate critical and emerging technologies so that it doesn't get out of hand? So these are the new types of economic security challenges we are seeing today.
Would you like to?
Briefly, I very much agree. What I what we have been discussing as well, and I hope we will get to maybe work some more on that, is the difficulty of how to accept that security rationale is coming in more and more parts of the economy, and without that undermining a lot of the free market economy, free trade, any of the international. I mean, it's so easy to pull up a security argument for anything. Oh, this has to be produced here. Oh, we can't buy it from there. We can't do this. We can't do that. We can't have the researchers coming from China or Iran, and all the ways we limit. It's so easy if we accept that security argument. It is real in many contexts, but I think it's still important to remember that a security argument should be the exception. It should be to say, there is a specific concern, therefore we draw a line here. The risk now is that we're starting into a kind of general geoeconomics where we just see the economics as another form of warfare, as we are in a general war that includes our economy and our societies and so on. I think that is a very problematic road to go down. So I think there's a difference between thinking economic security, which has constantly the ability to be balanced, and go full geoeconomics, which is really dangerous.
Dr. IGATA, are you interested in responding to?
So to be honest, we're still talking about this as we meet. So
we're trying to of our bilateral talk spilling over into the.
Maybe before I open to the floor, I just got one more thing that I want to ask you, which is ask you both actually. Sorry, before we go to the floor to open up for questions, I just have one more thing that I would like to ask, which is about the position of Japan in this very complicated, world that Professor WÆVER explained, and also the Nordic countries. How do they figure in this three-dimensional geopolitics model?
I think the Nordics are in many ways doing pretty well in the sense that, I mean, generally we have Europeanized much more. So the way we are dealing with Ukraine and the intensification of rivalry, we're doing that by being very European in many ways. So that's a change from the Cold War where we tried to stand in a kind of exceptional position. Now we're going full European, and that's sometimes more European than the other Europeans. And then at the same time, we also do have the whole tradition of being very involved in development work in Africa and so on, meaning that in a situation where this global south dimension opens up, we actually do have some very strong basis to build on if we could just remember our own history, which we're trying to at the moment. And Japan, I'm a little more in doubt. That's also one of the reasons I'm here. I hope to learn from a year in Japan. I think Europe is in a slightly easier position of actually being able to take charge of its own even military security, and just finally understanding that we can't rely on the US, which I think we should have understood long ago, but now finally we're learning it. The Japanese situation is more complicated in terms of how to imagine being able to hold its own against China with a US you can't rely on. That is more difficult when you're Japan than it is for you.
No, I completely agree on the last point because yes, Russia is a formidable foe, but it's tired, right? Its economy isn't that big. They do have nuclear weapons, but and Europe is strong enough. It's unified. You guys have the EU. You guys have nuclear weapons. You guys have the power to balance Russia without the US help. In Japan, or I would argue in East Asia, we don't have the same luxury. We need the US. But we can see that US is now trying to take a different position in the world, which means that in the short to mid-term and potentially the long term, of course, we have to continue engaging with the US. But at the same time, I think more and more we have to step up ourselves to try and fill the gap that the US has been creating in the international order.
Right. I'm sure we can just keep on discussing this. So I'm just going to go to the floor because we are running out of time. And thank you very much for the questions there. The first question is from Takeo Hoshi. And how does your analysis relate to the hegemonic theories a la Kindleberger and Gilpin, which seem to argue that unipolar is the only stable outcome. Do you think they're misleading?
Yes. Yes, yes, I actually do think they are. I think that's always been a bit of an American ideology of thinking that the US created this heaven for everyone else, and then unfortunately they got tired by upholding that nice situation for the rest of us and so on. I think that has always been a bit of a self-serving story. So I think there I'm actually more of a classic, more of a realist in the sense of thinking that I think unipolarity, as Kenneth Walsh was also saying, unipolarity is unstable. It is not possible for one state to be so dominant without automatically triggering counter moves and concerns and worries. Even if you are the nicest hegemon in the world, others would not trust you in being that. So others will worry that you have too much. So I think it's natural that there will be balancing and distance and so on happening in the world.
Akira, do you have any comments or are you okay?
No.
We can then go on to the next. Yeah. Okay. The next question is from Lucas Matsunaga. Looking ahead to 2030, the deadline for major international frameworks such as the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, what should we realistically expect from international community in terms of change? Which agendas are most likely to dominate global discussions, and if there will be changes in the binding nature or mechanisms to guarantee efficiency of those agreements. Finally, do you see a need for a dedicated international framework specifically focused on AI? There's a lot of questions, so you could one or
no. I think I'll be a bit brief on each then. The SDGs unfortunately look bad, right? I mean, the development goals we are falling behind, not least due to COVID and the general economic change. It's hard to, at the moment, to think about. It's also hard to think about the world in the bad shape we are now, being able to agree on the new round of goals. I think there's really a need for creative thinking there. We can't just do an updated version. We have to find a new way. There was a big change between the millennial goal and the SDGs in a good way. And I think we need a similar creative thinking for the third generation of this climate change. I do have hope there still. I mean, it's important if you look at the last IPCC reports, there's both good and bad news. In many ways, the new technologies are coming in on solar, et cetera. Many things are happening faster than expected. We are still behind target, but the conclusion basically from the scientists was that it's not impossible. In some sense, there is progress, but there's also a need for more action. And I think the current situation is exceptional of lack of this degree of non-cooperation. So I think it's important to keep the pressure, and the Paris framework is not completely hopeless in that sense. And then on things like AI and so on, that is an urgent discussion. I think there are some of these new technologies where we don't have the clue yet about what kind of institutional format to build around it. So that's an important discussion to have, a very interdisciplinary issue where you need the expertise from the natural scientists, the engineers, and so on to see what is actually possible points to anchor regulation and safety concerns on these new technologies.
IGATA, would you like to? Yep.
So if you go back to what the Sustainable Development Goal was about, it was an argument that you can have economic growth, environmental protection, and social justice all at the same time without sacrificing any of them. My argument has long been that in the era of economic security, where you have to think about the security of supply chains, of critical minerals, of everything, you can't have that, right? You have a quadrilemma where you have to sacrifice at least one to pursue the other, which means that perhaps for this international agreement in 2040 or 2050, the new goals must also incorporate the fact that countries now care about security, which means that we need some kind of a new way for the trade-offs.
That's a very good point.
Well, with those very important words from both speakers, I think we have to end. And thank you so much, WÆVER, for this fantastically stimulating talk, and for Akira, IGATA, for the brilliant comments. And we learned something today: economic security plus three-dimensional geopolitics. So thank you very much to the audience. And I'm sorry, some of you who wrote in questions, we simply didn't have time to get to you. So thank you so much, and please tune in to our other, I think, activities, webinars to come in the future. So thank you so much for all of us from Tokyo College.